It's on.
The legislature is back in session. We are still in motions.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules from the Committee on Education, Finance, and Taxation, I move to place the appointment of Mr. Carlo M. Leonguero to serve as a member of the Guam Community College Board of Trustees on the session agenda. The committee report was submitted on November 27 at 5 p.m.
On that motion, hearing no objection, motion carries. You're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to place Bill number 210-34 COR as substituted by the committee on the session agenda. An act to adopt the rules and regulation attached as Exhibit A hereto entitled The Rules and Regulation Governing the Joaquin Casey Conception II Compassionate Cannabis Use Act of 2013 and to amend Section 122503 AA of Article 25, Division 1, Chapter 102 of Title 10, Guam Code annotated relative to allowing medical use of cannabis by non-residents and to modify other definitions contained in medical cannabis law.
For the information of the body, the clerk has provided you with a copy of it, just in case any of you are wondering what it is. And also to inform all of you that I understand it is up on it's online. So is there an objection? Hearing no objection, motion carries. You recognized.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to place Bill number 167-34 LS on the session agenda. An act to add Article 5 to Chapter 9, Title 12, Guam Code annotated relative to directing the Guam Business Bureau to develop and publish a request for information relative to developing Guam as a home port cruise ship industry.
Again, colleagues, you all have a copy of it, just in case you want to see what it is. And also it is up on the online. Is there an objection? Senator Addett, I saw you rise. No? Any objection? Motion carries. Senator Addett, Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move to place the following from the Committee on Housing, Utilities, Public Safety, and Homeland Security. Reports out the nomination of Mr. Andrew Gale to serve as a member of the Guam Solid Waste Authority Board of Directors with a recommendation to do confirm and to be placed in the voting file.
Any objection? We're in legislative concurrence, yes. Any objection? None. Carries.
Mr. Speaker, I move to place the following from the Committee on Housing, Utilities, Public Safety, and Homeland Security. The nomination of Cecilia G. Mantanonia to serve as a member of the Guam Housing Corporation Board of Directors with a recommendation to do confirm and to be placed in the voting file.
On that motion, any objection?
Mr. Speaker, I move to place the following from the Committee on Housing, Utilities, Public Safety, and Homeland Security. The nomination of Mr. Joseph M. McDonald to serve as a Commissioner of the Public Utilities Commission with the recommendation to do confirm to be placed in the voting file.
Any objection?
Mr. Speaker, from the Committee on Education, Finance, and Taxation, wish to place the nomination of Dr. Michelle M.S. Santos, EDD, to serve as a community at large member of the Guam Commission for Educator Certification, with a recommendation to do confirm, to be placed in the voting file.
Any objection?
Mr. Speaker, I move to place from the Committee on Environment, Land, Agriculture, and Procurement Reform, the nomination of Mrs. Amanda L.G. Santos to serve as a member of the Chamorro Land Trust Commission, with the recommendation to do confirm and to be placed in the voting file.
Any objection?
Mr. Speaker, I move to place from the Committee on Education, Finance, and Taxation the nomination of Carlo M. Leon Guerrero to serve as a member of the Guam Community College Board of Trustees, to be placed in the voting file.
Any objection? Thank you. That concludes the legislative concurrence. We are now in second reading. At the top of the second reading file is bill number 86-34 COR. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to move to accept Bill 86-34 as corrected by the prime sponsor and further substituted on the floor.
Again, colleagues, the clerk has preliminarily provided all of you with a copy of it. Do you wish any time to review it, or any objections to accepting?
Here's another one. You want me to explain it?
Can the sponsor maybe point out what's the new portions of this?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. Mr. Speaker, there are two changes to the initial bill. First, just some stylistic changes as recommended by legal counsel, proper references. But the second one, probably more substantive, would be on page 3, section 63117.3, line 61. No effect to existing marine protected areas on Guam. And it reads as follows: nothing in this act shall allow for any changes to existing MPAs on Guam. To those colleagues I spoke with earlier, it's basically, I refer to this as the Tetro Amendment in appreciation of Linda Tetro's contribution to the discussion on the bill.
Is there any objection to accepting this substituted version with that included? Any objection? Hearing none. Bill's accepted. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like also to move to place Bill 86-34 in the third reading file, and I'd like to discuss it.
Any objection? Please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bill 86-34 is essentially an act that allows the people of Guam to have access to another form of conservation. It's a form of conservation that takes into consideration all aspects of marine resource management, that extends beyond the monitoring of a specific aquatic animal as an example. Rather, this specific act takes into consideration, or actually places into statute, a planning mechanism that is a lot more holistic in its nature and approach, by allowing the affected village to address the commercial, recreational, and traditional practices associated with that coastal community. At its core, the Marine Conservation Act of 2018 empowers coastal villages to have a greater say in managing its waters and all related activities that may affect the marine resources associated with that village. By doing so, Mr. Speaker, it's my contention that we bring decision-making to the lowest possible level, that of the grassroots village level. It insulates policymaking from being driven by any one agency or constituency. It's an attempt to strike that balance between science and the management of our precious marine resources. As you will find, Bill 86-34 has both the oral and written support by the Departments of Agriculture and the Bureau of Statistics and Plans, in addition to submitted written testimony by the mayors of Humatec and Piti.
Any senator wish to be heard on the bill? Senator Agon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I certainly stand in recognition of the proposed measure and commend the sponsor for moving forward with this initiative, but most importantly for allowing for the insertion of maintaining and sustaining the marine preserves. So, Mr. Speaker, I know the language right now that presently reads, "Nothing in this act shall allow for any changes to existing marine protected areas on Guam." And I would like to suggest to the sponsor that, in fact, the language be more specific and directed towards the provision that established the marine preserves. And it would be subchapter B of Chapter 2, Title 16, Guam Code Annotated, so that there's a direct reference to the marine preserves protected areas, and certainly it would be more specific in nature and directed in terms of what provision it would allow for continual protection of our marine preserves. So I would like to make that suggestion, and I thank again the sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Speaker, for inserting this particular provision and recognizing that the marine preserves is a critical component of the preservation of our shorelines. Thank you very much on our sea life.
On the Uggan amendment? Any objection? There being no objection. Oh, wait. Okay. Senator Abbott first and then Senator Nelson. You have an objection? Oh, I thought your hand went up. On the Uggan amendment, is there an objection? Go ahead, you may.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So just to clarify, we are going to add in the verbiage of including this to be a marine preservation, not a fisheries management. Is that what it is? Can you just clarify on the amendment a little bit better?
Thank you very much, Senator, for that question. What it would provide is a specific section that highlights and recognizes the marine preserves here in Guam. So subchapter B of Chapter 2, Title 16, highlights the 5 different areas along our coastline that has been identified as marine preserves. That's what it does. It provides that specific detail and direction in terms of what the restriction would be. Thank you, Senator.
Senator Ada and then Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So speaking on the main motion.
Yeah,
right.
Well, yeah, I guess there is no objection, unless there's an objection. Did you have an objection to the Uggan amendment? Senator Lee, is that an objection to the Uggan amendment? Oh, okay. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and buenas colleagues. I'd like to thank the retiring speaker and the mover of the amendment for bringing this up. We are in receipt of testimony from the Bureau of Statistics and Plans, and one of the first initial concerns that they had is exactly what Senator Uggan had mentioned, the Marine Conservation Act of 2017, and that it exists, it similarly references the Guam Ocean and Fisheries Conservation Act of 2015. Which is Public Law 33-144. And there are a number of other recommendations that BSP has had to improve the bill, and I'll be talking about that later, but I stand in support of the Uggan amendment. Thank you.
Any objection to the Uggan amendment? On the main motion, Senator Ada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the bill, certainly the idea of having a bottom-up approach to managing the marine resources, starting at the community level, certainly I think is a very good idea. The concern that I have right now is we have in the past also been trying to protect our marine resources. So the marine preservation areas that were established, and I imagine there's rules and regulations or that kind of govern those areas. And then we have And then we have the Guam Ocean and Fisheries Conservation Act of 2015. And I presume that also provides some governance on our marine resources out there. Now we have Bill 86, which basically, and I guess you can take a look at those two other programs as being a top-down sort of governance on our marine resources. And now we have Bill 86, which proposes a bottom-up. And the question that I would have to ask is, are we going to be going contrary to, I mean, we want to give that autonomy to the communities to manage their resources. But, you know, are we going to be going head-on, button heads with these other programs and mandates that have been put in place already? So maybe the question that I would like the sponsor of the bill to respond to is, does Bill 86 fill in a certain gap that these previous mandates, you know, failed to cover?
Senator.
Thank you. That was an excellent question. In my opinion, it does. The difference that I would suggest between an MPA and a community-based fisheries management system, first of all, just to put something in antecedent to that, I've had conversations with both the Mayor of Humatec and Mayor of Pidi, and both officials have the political will within their respective municipality to undertake such a planning process. As a matter of fact, the Mayor of Humatec is no stranger to the concept. The only thing missing, Mr. Speaker, would be the legal authorization to begin and sustain such a grassroots level planning process that can find its way through the system. And so it is possible, to the credit of the retiring speaker, it is possible that the two forms of planning could collide. But I would encourage us that if there should be a conflict of priorities, that the priorities always rest with the people in the affected areas. And so, for example, this planning process, if it was to start, it would start in Humatec as explicitly articulated in this bill. And then it would go through the planning process. They would have their municipal planning council meetings. And even before such a plan could be acted upon, Mr. Speaker, it would have to go through the AAA process. So they'll have to publish public notice for the entire community to weigh in. This would assume that the respective agencies, partner agencies, advocating agencies, not-for-profits would weigh in on the discussion, and then we can have a debate on the application of resources as they apply to the priorities of that municipality and or the territory. But yes, it is possible that the two forms of planning could collide. But the difference between the two is that villages, coastal villages, could actually elect to participate. They could elect to participate in a community-based fisheries management plan. This does not allow, this does not require other villages to comply with this form of planning. So again, in a nutshell, the Marine Conservation Act really, at its core, as I mentioned when I opened up, Mr. Speaker, just establishes in statute another planning mechanism for marine conservation.
Senator.
Thank you. And so then I would have to ask, what happens then in the event that this community-based plan contradicts the Conservation Act of 2015, what has been established under the Marine Preservation Act? Should the community-based plan supersede those?
Please continue, I'm sorry.
Huh?
Please continue. No, I was just trying to get the attention so I can come down and speak. No, continue.
I think that was it. That was it.
I know, I posed my question to the...
Do you yield, Senator?
Yeah, I do, and that's a great question. It's a good scenario, hypothetical. If that should happen, I would have to assume, based on the process, that it comes up to the collective wisdom of the legislature and or the governor. But I think it's a worthwhile debate, and I'll give you an example. Let's say, and I'm not against the MPAs. As a matter of fact, like Senator Uggan, Nelson, and Bisco Lee, I too support preserving or maintaining the integrity of the existing MPAs. But let's just use that as an example in response to your question to illustrate what could happen. So in an MPA, as an example, that addresses, I would assume, particular fish biomass or particular habitat or ecosystem. But a community-based fisheries management plan, my colleagues, actually opens up the opportunity to address other things beyond the habitat. It allows you to address things like recreational use of the waters. It allows you to address things like the commercial use of the waters. It allows you to take an active position, and a firm one, on the advocacy of the practice of traditional fishery knowledge and or cultural practices. I'll give you an example. Let's say for tomorrow, Cultural and Heritage Day in the village of Homatec, that municipality has decided and has adopted and has gone through the process of establishing a rule through the AAA process that on that particular day there will be no marine watercraft like a jet ski or any other type of modern equipment for the purposes of observing the use of traditional watercraft on that special day. That's a provision that could be adopted within this community-based fisheries management plan, as opposed to a marine sanctuary, or like what the United States has decided to do, a marine monument in a much larger scale, or I guess even in another case, a marine protected area. And so if that conflict was to occur, then I welcome it, because now we can sift through top-level policy proposals and decision-making and the priorities of the community based on the knowledge and practice and experience of those who've been doing this for thousands or at least a few hundred years in their respective coastal village.
So let me take my question down to really a lot simpler example. We have the marine preserve areas, and there are some segments of the community that may argue that, hey, you know, the Achang Bay preserve area, we want to open that up, but we want to establish another preserve area. Now, that certainly is a good example of how something like this could run in conflict with your MPA programs. So there's no language in here that says that in the event of that sort of conflict, that the community-based plan, whatever that may be, will supersede all other plans. But otherwise, without that kind of language, basically it says you can go ahead and establish any preserve that you want, but what has already been established shall remain.
Is that a question you're asking him to yield to?
Yes, Madam Speaker.
Do you yield?
Thank you, I do. And actually, I'd like to refer the kind senator from Barrigada to page 3. It's one of the amendments introduced. Actually, it's very explicit in the bill that based on this specific bill, 8634, nothing in this bill or this act shall construe or even suggest that you can undo an existing MPA. Now, if the village of Inalahan decided to have a town hall meeting and say, we want Inalahan Bay to be an MPA, as an example, there's nothing to preclude them from pursuing that through this body. But if they decided as a municipality to say, you know what, we want to take a more inclusive approach. We want to involve other stakeholder groups beyond just the scientists. We want to talk to GVB and everybody else. So we are going to elect to apply our legal right to this planning mechanism known as a fisheries, community-based fisheries management plan.
Madam Speaker, just one final concern that I have. As I was reading through the testimonies, the Department of Agriculture came out and basically says, insofar as the responsibility for developing the plans, there's no impact on the department because the community is going to take the responsibility to do that. Insofar as enforcement, there's no impact on the department because the community is going to do that. And so, so we're putting everything down to the community to basically initiate that planning process with assistance from the Bureau of Planning and with assistance from the Department of Agriculture. But otherwise, it appears from the testimonies that were given by the departments is that, yeah, this is a good plan, but, and it's no impact on us because it's all going to be down at the community level. And I'm not sure that they have the resources to be able to initiate, at that level, these plans. So I do have a concern about just who really is responsible for developing these plans. Ultimately, putting it together, running it through the administrative adjudication trap, and ultimately coming down through here. So that's going to be a very involved process, and I don't know that the municipalities have those kind of resources to go after that particular rabbit. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Atta. Is there anyone else who would like to speak on the bill? Senator Cruz, or Speaker Cruz?
Thank you very much. Madam Speaker, I have to admit, and I'm sure the main sponsor will point out the fact that when he initially introduced this piece of legislation, I was not in support of it. I think if anybody reads the committee report and the hearing, they'll see that at the hearing, I also had some questions, because my question was that with 19 villages and you're out there on a 10-foot boat or 15-foot boat, when do you know you're in Umatec's waters and comply with Umatec? Or when do you float into Mauricio and have to know? Those were the issues that I had. And I continued to have major reservations about this legislation until a couple of months ago. The Pacific Judicial Council sponsored a sustainability conference, and it brought in all the most renowned fisheries and marine lab people. Dr. Richmond flew back from Hawaii. People flew in from all around the country on this issue, and I was schooled, I have to admit it, that they made me understand that my concerns, that this is not that novel. They pointed out that in Hawaii, each of the islands has their own, and I countered by saying, well, yeah, those, I know where 3 miles out from the main island of Hawaii is, and where the 3 mile is from Oahu and from Kailua and whatever, all the islands. That's easy to tell, but how can you tell where the line is between Umatec and Mauricio when you're out in the water? I was told somehow you can shoot a line out and people will know. And besides that, the one saving grace of this substituted bill today was the inclusion of that one provision, that nothing in this bill will affect the current MPAs, nor could it. And if there was ever a conflict between what a municipality wanted to do, much like the federal government and the local government, we can add, but we can't subtract. We can't give fewer rights. We can increase it, but we can't. And in the example that was given by the retiring speaker, or in response to the retiring speaker, it's a possibility that a village could decide to, on its own, establish its own MPA. That would not be in conflict with the statute that we currently have, because that's an additional MPA. But if the village of Piti decided it was going to de-establish the and not recognize the MPA that currently exists there, they wouldn't have the authority to do that, because that authority was established in this body, and only this body can do that. So with that recognition, I still have my problems with the lines, but if those with PhDs in marine biology tell me that this is a way to try to get each one of the 19 villages involved in marine conservation, and if they'll think about it, maybe some of them won't even try. I mean, I'm sure there'll be some villages that won't care about wanting to do something. But if we all get involved in trying to think about how we can preserve the marine environment, I think the world would be better for it. And so not reluctantly, but I acknowledge that I will support the bill today.
Thank you, Speaker Cruz. Senator Muña?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of this bill, and I commend the author for giving the people more power to their voice in protecting their community. And I really feel that we can think about all the consequences of what can happen or what may happen, but really simply this bill is just a plan, an act to give the people the power to protect their own land, their marine and their resources. And really that's all it is. It's giving the people the power to voice their concerns with what goes around them. So I rise in support of this, and I thank the author for giving the people the power to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Torres, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too was at that conference, and I saw the importance of marine conservation. But what I did also note is in that conference, a lot of the discussion about community-based management had to do with watchdog type of situations where the reporting and the authority to enforce still remained at the government level. And what I want to point out, one of the speakers, particularly the speaker who hails from the village of Barragata, alluded to the bottom-up approach to this piece of legislation, where we are giving authority now to the municipal level. And what I'm concerned about, and perhaps the mover of this legislation can yield to my concerns, and I'll try to put it in a form of a question. When you delegate enforcement in the municipal council, in the municipal level, if they were to develop their own rules and regulations, there is a compliance factor to that. And it's presumed that compliance will be written at the community level, the village level. But we also know that there are a lot of federal laws and local laws that govern the shores and the resources associated with our oceans. So to what extent do the two coexist or conflict? Because you cannot, I believe, have a situation where you mandate through a law like this that the government level is beholden to enforce the rules and regulations that are created at a municipal level. It is a bottom-up effect, and I just I see this as though that you're delegating authority to them to regulate, but it's not so clear where the lines are delineated, because there are clearly established federal and local laws that govern shores in the ocean. So are we then implying that we're going to create our own mini enforcement within the municipalities, and it is that is their prerogative to develop their rules and regs and enforcement mechanisms? So they're like an enforcement agent within that, or are you implying here that they can set their own parameters and that somehow the regulation is the government is now obligated to regulate something that is at a municipal level. So that was the one thing that I thought was a little confusing, because I understand the need to get the community involved. But I do know the model that was used, for example, in Hawaii was more of a watchdog. Keep your eyes open, report immediately, become educated, and help the agency share that information. So it was empowering them to be advocates. But when we're talking about now giving somebody the authority to write their own laws, their rules and regs, we're not telling them what they are. We're saying you do it, and then there's an implied enforcement mechanism. So if the, and I understand it was a very long-winded question, but I believe the author gets the gist of my concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I could respond. That's an excellent question. It's one that two other senators here had before we went into session this morning, Mr. Speaker. You know, first, that assumes that additional restrictions or additional requirements and or resources are needed to monitor activities. And that's a good assumption. Let's just take that down the road for what it's worth. I think it's an excellent question. My hope is, as with any planning process, once the planning body, in this case the municipality, conducts its initial assessment and establishes priorities, and let's say in fact they want to apply stricter controls because they believe that there's over harvesting, or maybe to a more flatter area, there's actually the illegal harvesting of sea cucumbers. And so they need additional help and resources to prevent that because it's adversely affecting that habitat, that ecosystem. Well, I would hope, it's my hope, that as they establish that in the form of a written plan, as they submit it for consideration by the municipality, as they adopt it and move it forward to the state level, or in this case, the territorial level, that in fact it would have a direct bearing in how we establish the priorities of this territory, of Guahan. I'll give you an example. When the government of Guam is in receipt of federal monies, they don't do this arbitrarily. Most of the time, based on my experiences as a director of BSP and in other planning capacities, these are established based on state-level priorities as articulated by the administration. Those monies are then applied to those areas. So to use the speaker's example, which was a good one, for the need for geospatial planning, for the need to establish a marine spatial plan that articulates and outlines areas that you can or cannot swim in or fish. And let's say that there was an intruder, an unauthorized vessel with people who are jumping off and scuba tanking and raping the reefs, to be quite visual. Well, perhaps it's our hope that what could come out of that is not the delegation of authority to arrest or cite, perhaps, but how about the acquisition of equipment that can promote remote monitoring, where you get a novel ranger program or sea ranger program where they can observe and report through the use of drones, and then the appropriate law enforcement personnel can come out. Or what's to say that this body, if we find out that that in fact is the case and it's prevalent in one or more coastal villages, that we don't prioritize the use of the people's dollars to go out there and enforce that. Because as hypothetical as that may sound, it's a reality, and you won't know it. Most of us don't know it. We hear it, it's anecdotal, but the reality is it's out there. And people like Michael Duenas and the Fishermen's Co-op can tell you that there are ways to police that, but we don't have the authority. And so I guess the direct answer would be this plan, if done properly, can assist the Guam Legislature and the Governor of Guahan into establishing fiscal priorities to meet the goals and objectives of that coastal village. That's the hope of any planning mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're still with Senator Torres, and then we'll go to Senator Uggan, then Senator Lee.
I just want to, and I understand what you're saying, but it then reinforces my concern, which is if we were to know what the parameters are with a law, we set down the law and then we delegate somebody to write the rules and regs that outline that law. And I believe it's the idea of intelligible principle, where we set the law and then we, much like we did with cannabis, We established that this is the law regarding medicinal cannabis, and then we delegate the authority for somebody to write the rules and regs to allow that to happen. But in this case, what we're doing is it's very open-ended, and that's my concern, is it's so open-ended, and the bill also provides for delegation, continued delegation, that it starts with one pilot project and it can be delegated by agriculture, the mayors, or the municipal planning council throughout. So I don't disagree with the principle. I just believe that it needs to be tightened because it's unclear exactly what it is that we're attempting to establish here. In principle, I believe we're trying to set up a fisheries management that's specific to the villages, but you know, I believe that those parameters should be a little tightened so that we're not leaving things to chance, because as legislatures, that's kind of our obligation, is to be very clear about what it is what the laws are that we pass, that we envision, and based on good sound policy, and then hand it over to somebody to come up with the rules and regs. I think in this case we're doing it backwards, and that's not to say it can't be done, but it's a very awkward and very unclear process that this legislation is undertaking. But in principle, coastal management is important. Getting the communities involved is important. I just have to look a little closer about whether this bill actually accomplishes that, or whether it sets us up for uncertainties that we can't even contemplate because we are not steering the direction of that policy. And that's the point I'm trying to make. Generally, the intelligible principle is the legislature sets the rule, this is the law, and then empowers somebody to write the rules and regs for that law to become effective. Much the same way we're doing with cannabis right now. That's a tangible example. And I think in this case, we're not doing that. We're just saying, we delegate it to you, absent the fact that there are federal laws in existence and local laws in existence, and they're being governed, and they're being governed, and they're being enforced by Department of Agriculture, for example, Parks and Recreation. But notwithstanding that, we're going to create another tier, and it's I'll just let it go there. I think I've said enough, but the general principle is you set the direction, they put the rules and regs, we all understand who's in charge and how and what the parameters are. In this case, I agree, it is bottoms up, and there's really no clear direction on what exactly they're to do. And that's my concern, not my objection, but just my concern.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Dragon?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to, first of all, thank our legal counsel for bringing the appropriate provision that should have been inserted to address a concern that I had raised a little earlier, and that's ensuring that we make direct reference to the provision that highlights the marine preserves. And it's under the Guam Administrative Rules and Regulations other than what I had previously quoted. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move for a reconsideration of the previous decision of the body.
Is there any objection to a motion to reconsider the earlier amendment made by Senator Uggan?
And Mr. Speaker, if I can...
There being none. Is there an objection? There being none.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Senators. And Mr. Speaker, if I can make it general so that our legal counsel can provide the direct reference, I have it here, but rather than reading it out loud, if we can allow for the legal counsel to make the direct reference to the provision in the GAR that identifies the marine preserves, I'd like to move for that motion, please, Mr. Speaker.
So does everybody understand the motion now being made by Senator Uggan is that legal counsel be given the authority to rewrite Section 3 to include a provision that specifically protects the current marine preserve areas using the GAR provisions as opposed to just the statute, or whatever combinations he yeah, no, I understand. I mean, I'm section 6. Is there any objection to that? Or do you wish that we stop and have it rewritten before you vote on it?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, can we make that request to see it written?
All right, we'll take a recess until it's written.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Senator Uggan, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It would read, beginning on line 64, page 3, and after the word Guam, comma, as provided in 9 GAR Chapter 12. And that is the provision that makes direct reference and identifies the marine preserves on island. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Any objection to the amendment? Anyone wish to speak on the proposed amendment? Okay. Motion passed. Go. No, I believe we've completed Senator, we're Senator Lee now. Senator Lee?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to thank the sponsor for his efforts in bringing this bill to the floor. I'd also like to thank our stakeholders, the fishers that he worked with, the individuals from BSP who provided testimony, as well as our mayors, Ms. Tetro, and a number of community advocates who've submitted testimony and have really improved this bill and helped us to see all of the different pieces coming together. With that said, I'd like to just read some of the concerns that were raised by the Bureau of Statistics and Plans as part of the testimony. This was a letter submitted to Chairman Atta with regard to this bill. And BSP certainly supports the intent of Bill 86-34 as it calls for strong community support and really the participation of our community to address emerging ocean and coastal marine issues, to achieve, I think, sustainable fisheries, to really preserve our traditional cultural practices and promote economic diversification and development. But they did have several concerns, and if the author will yield, primarily their concern was that the bill didn't mention the involvement of the Fishermen's Cooperative, the UOG Marine Lab, Western Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Council, and other fisheries organizations in the technical planning and for the designation of managed areas and plans. And specifically, BSP was concerned that the Department of Agriculture didn't have the capacity or resources to take the lead on this. And so I just would like for the author to speak a little bit on that, as well as their recommendation for including a funding provision in this legislation to provide support for the Department of Agriculture's Civilian Volunteer Conservation Officer Reserve Program. I think I share some of the concerns of retiring speakers and other members of this body that we are putting mandates on some of our agencies that are already really burdened with, and we're not giving them the resources to do their job. So if this author would yield.
I do, Mr. Speaker.
Please.
Legitimate points raised by the retiring speaker. First of all, I didn't include them in the specific language of the bill because we don't have jurisdiction over Westpac. I would hate to compel an NGO like the Fishermen's Cooperative to come to the table as well. But the fact is, for those senators who participated, we've had 4 meetings, and at the table were representatives from the Marine Lab, Fishermen's Cooperative, thanks to Michael Duenas and others. Felix Regis is an example from the Guam-based advisory panel. So they're all active and engaged participants in this discussion. But I did not name them explicitly because I don't really feel that we have, first of all, I don't even know if we do, and I doubt it, but I think it is incumbent upon the Chief Planning Authority of the territory, which would be BSP, to offer its technical assistance. And I do appreciate the advocacy for additional monies for the Department of Agriculture's programs. But you know, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, we really don't know what we need to fund if you don't have a plan. And so that's the whole point of the bill. Bill 8634 essentially allows the people to plan. And once we have a plan, we can have an active discussion about what the resources and priorities of the territory would be. We might not require additional agricultural conservation people, or we might require 3 times as many, but we won't know until we allow them the opportunity to take the first step for themselves.
Thank you. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, absolutely. And I want to thank again the author, the sponsor of this legislation, for being open to answering these questions and also mentioning that the ability of BSP to offer technical assistance when they're called upon. And I think that also goes to an additional point that they had raised about the bill is written calling for the mayor and the Municipal Planning Council of Humatec to develop their community-based plans with assistance from DOA and the director of BSP. But they did recommend that we identify a separate funding source for them to obtain these technical supports. I know that the retiring speaker has some experience in this area and has done some good work in the past with the Bureau of Statistics and Plans. And so again, I just want for him, I ask that he yield to a question about identifying additional funding sources to maintain that technical assistance.
Okay, I guess it's the second go around at the question of technical assistance. You know, having been the former director, technical assistance is a relative term. I mean, I don't know if we're wondering if we need help setting up the maps, pulling up the land app to determine the geospatial coordinates of an area. I don't know if technical assistance means bringing in an outside facilitator, but I can go on the record to say that I've been conversant with the front office, and I would suspect that they would make good on their commitment to participate and provide technical assistance within their internal capacity. And so, again, if we really wanted to push the envelope, colleagues, I think we can reprioritize how certain federal monies are applied to certain programs, or even local monies from this Guam legislature. But again, that's putting the cart before the horse. We really don't know what the priorities of the village of Humatec are going to be. What I do know is that Mayor Johnny Kanata of Humatec has the political will and the desire to do something more and greater for the coastal village and the people of Humatec. That much I know. And so this bill attempts to give them the legal authority to start the planning process and determine for themselves what's in the best interest of all persons concerned, starting with the village of Humatec and their own people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, thank you very much. And again, I just want to commend the author, commend all of the stakeholders who participated in this process, and I think our main goal in all of this is really to achieve sustainable fisheries and to make sure that we're managing all of our resources and preserving our cultural practices as best we can. So again, I thank the author and I thank you all for your time.
On the main motion, Senator Nelson, then Senator Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do like to thank the sponsor of this bill, because this is the intent of the bill is very well served. However, there's something that I'm really concerned about, is because we're looking at this as a sustainable way to protect our waters and our reefs and of course our natural habitat, our ecological habitat. My concern is that in this bill it reads, an act to add new subsection 63101, 63117.1, and 63117.2 to Article 1 of Chapter 63, Title 5, Guam Code Annotated, relative to the development of a community-based fisheries management strategy to be known and cited as the Marine Conservation Act of 2018. And so just reading it, you know, it looks like the whole intent of this bill is to preserve and protect the natural resources, the ecological system of our marine habitat. However, when we include the word of fisheries management, the whole purpose of a fisheries management is really to develop a commercial purpose for the habitat with what we're developing. So, you know, basically we would populate more fish for a commercial purpose to bring it out and use it for, you know, as a way to make money. And so it kind of contradicts, you know, the Conservation Act, that the intent of conservation is preservation, and then the whole purpose of a fishery management kind of contradicts, you know, because now we're turning it into a commercial aspect. Now, I don't think that is the purpose of this bill, but that is my concern, that in the end, instead of finding sustainable measures to protect the Bay of Humatec and develop its ecological system, the marine life in its natural habitat, I think that perhaps that we may be giving them, this bill may be giving them the authority to turn this into a commercial business where it might just harm the reef and the natural habitat a little bit further. Secondly, there has been a lot of concerns amongst our colleagues with the funding sources and the, what authority really has the jurisdiction to enforce whatever rules and regulations are put in place. And so, especially the conservation officers, the Department of Agriculture, they have a great concern there. And then thirdly, just one last thing. Actually, well, I forgot it, but I'm sure I'll mention it to the sponsor. Otherwise, I support the intent of the bill. It's just if I'm trying to see if there's some amendments to make it a little bit more specific, that it's really used to sustain and preserve the natural habitat of Humatec. I think it's a great move forward. It allows the people of Humatec, it empowers them, and there has been many projects done down in the Humatec Bay where even the local students go out there and they count, they collect data, they count the different types of corals that are populating, the different kind of species that are out there, and they're actually using the species name. And so I commend this author, but I'll try to see if I can make an amendment further to make sure that this is used as a preservation and sustainable way instead of a commercial purpose, as in the fisheries. You usually do build fisheries for commercial purposes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. On the main motion, Senator Morrison, you're recognized. After Senator Morrison, who else wishes to speak? Thank you. Senator Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the author for allowing me to take part as a co-sponsor of this measure. I also want to point out the efforts that were made by our colleague, Senator Ada, and I think some of the events you've taken place with also, Mr. Speaker, with regards to the Southern Development Master Plan, where we toured every southern village and heard their testimony on potential projects or plans that may impact their communities. Mr. Speaker, when I look at this measure, and I think of it as also a way of taking what the people of Humatec, the past leaders of that community, and MPCs have done to work with their constituents and self-regulate the community. For generations, even before my time, that area has been self-regulated. They've done an excellent job of monitoring the area and ensuring that the area is shared and protected. I see it as a way of putting what they already do, their best practices, into writing, and maybe sharing it with other communities that may want to model off something, because it's my understanding this is the first of any kind to be put in process to develop a fisheries management plan. I was at a Humatec revitalization plan meeting a couple of weeks or last week, and as I've taken part of many other meetings, Mr. Speaker, and a lot of things were discussed, and not only what will be the sentiments of the community, their thoughts, how we'll take their ideas and put it into models, or how people want to see the village of Humatec grow in the future. But what's also important to highlight is there's other plans in process, such as the Southern Development Master Plan, the Humatec Revitalization Plan that is being carried out by the American Institutes of Architects. And also, we have the Marine Association Cruise Liner Industry that has a plan in process that also talks about incorporating a port of entry for the village as well. There's many plans that are outside the community. And so we have to ensure there is consistency with plans that are ongoing, and also ensure there's no redundancies, ensure there's just that collaboration with these other plans that could possibly work. So I think the community of Humatec are very aware of that as a result of the Southern Development Master Plan meeting, the Humatec Revitalization Plan meeting, to also understand that there are plans outside of the community that are ongoing and that we will have to also support that it could work in our community. I like the fact that the author included the Administrative Adjudication Act process here, because that will also ensure that there could also be some effort to come back or ensure there's consistency of these other plans to revise or add to as we go on with this plan. But to ensure that this is carried out, Mr. Speaker, I like to proffer an amendment. I'm not sure if everybody has the amendment in front of them, but on page 3, beginning on line 44, it will read, consistent with the Humatec Revitalization Plan, Southern Development Master Plan, and any other development plan approved by the Community of Humatec. So that will be the amendment prior to, and it will go on to the Director of the Department of Agriculture and Director of the Bureau of Stats and Plans shall provide necessary assistance to the Mayor and the Municipal Planning Council of Humatec. So that, Mr. Speaker, that will ensure that the parties here, the Mayor, the Director of Agriculture, and those that are involved, key stakeholders that are involved in the planning process, will ensure that it's consistent with these ongoing plans. So that's my amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Does everybody have that amendment? We'll just take a short recess while that's, unless, does anybody require to see? It's being copied. We'll take a short recess. Senator Morrison, you're recognized. No, everybody has a copy of the amendment now, so on the amendment, can we have order? Senator Morrison, you're recognized. The amendment has been distributed. Anyone wish to speak on the Morrison amendment? On the Morrison amendment, it's been distributed. Senator Castro, Madam Vice Speaker, is your hand, did your hand go up? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to express my support for the amendment, and I want to thank my colleague, Senator Morrison, for bringing his institutional knowledge to the table, having served as the former director of the Bureau of Statistics and Plans, and of course, residing in the village of Humatec. So I appreciate your contribution, Senator Morrison, and I fully endorse the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support this amendment, and I thank the author of it. I just wanted to make a suggestion that we take the amendment, the underlined portion, and put it at the end of that sentence so that it's the plan that shall be consistent with the Humatic Revitalization Plan, the Southern Development Master Plan, so that the plans are all consistent as opposed to the actions of the Department of Ag and the Bureau of Statistics and Plans shall be consistent. So it's really just a I think that would read better and make it very clear that we just want these plans to be consistent. Thank you. So I would make that motion to amend the amendment.
I'm sorry, so...
Mr. Speaker, it's to take the underlined portion of the amendment, the new language, and add it to the very end of that sentence, the same sentence, but at the end. So after the community-based Humatec Fisheries Management Plan, consistent with the Humatic Revitalization Plan, the Southern Development Master Plan, and any other development plan approved by the community of Humatec.
On the Terlahi amendment to the Morrison amendment, Senator Atta. There's been an amendment. Do you wish to speak on the Terlahi amendment? The Terlahi amendment was, I guess, it's more how you write the sentence, whether or not you preface it or you end it with it.
Well, I have no problems with the amendments. Basically, it's a relocation where in the paragraph it's to be put. But I just and so I guess that's the amendment we're speaking on now, right?
Correct. Do you have any objection to it?
I just can't help but think that now the community fisheries management plan is now going to be subservient to every other thing. So when all these other plans change, and that change, I imagine, is contrary to the Humatec, the community plan, then I guess it's going to obviate that component of that plan. And so what it comes down to is that community-based plan is going to get jerked around every time there's an amendment to these other plans. And that can get quite confusing down the road. And so, but I certainly support the amendment of putting that change at the end of the sentence, and I also support the amendment that has been proffered by Senator Morrison. It's just a concern that I have about then how effectively this is going to just get this community-based plan jerked around, because it is now tied or subservient to all these other higher level plans. And so it's going to be a moving target. Thank you.
It's the nature of a confederacy, unfortunately. Senator, there's no objection to the, do you have an objection to her motion to move it? So the Terlahi amendment is adopted. And on the main motion as amended, I mean on the motion as amended by Senator Morrison, anyone wish to speak? On the Morrison amendment, any objection? Oh, I'm sorry.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to close briefly with some of the concerns shared by my colleague regarding the potential of the fisheries management plan being subservient to these other plans. I understand that. That's why I want to make it clear that Southern Development Master Plan, it was really the grand all plans of the southern communities is really what we hope that all these plans, like for example, the Inarahan revitalization plan is speaking with the trust that would agreed with the community will be integrated into the Southern Development Master Plan, and same with what was understood by the community that the Humatic Revitalization Plan will also be incorporated into the Southern Development Master Plan. And I think the same thing will full well be with the Fisheries Management Plan to be also incorporated into the Southern Development Master Plan. I think, yes, they're all components of this whole Southern Development Master Plan, and I want to ensure that we will continue to monitor this and work closely with our community leaders. And as this process continues to go smooth, it's taking some time, but I think with this amendment, it will ensure that we don't have something at the forefront knowing it's not compatible with the overall plan. Thank you.
So there being no objection, the Morrison amendment as amended by Vice Speaker Terlahi is on the main motion. Oh, I'm sorry. Vice Speaker, you have an amendment on the floor. You wish to speak on it? Yeah, I received your amendment. Does everybody have her amendment?
Yes, I'd like to speak on the bill, Mr. Speaker, and I rise in support of this bill, and I want to thank the author. It took a lot of work, I think, to get us all to understand the implications of this, and at first I thought it was going to be a free-for-all, but I want to make clear that that's not what this bill is intended to do, and from the remarks of the author, it seems very clear that the author intends that this is going to be an increased method of conservation of our fishing areas, our fishing stock, and in order to grow them, of course, to benefit the communities. And so I do have one amendment that is, but before I proffer that, so this amendment which should talk about that this bill is going to be implemented consistent with all existing laws regarding fish take and methods of fishing and the rules and regulations that have already been adopted by law. So that no village could come in and say, you can now take, fish smaller than what we allow right now, or all those requirements that have been put in place over many years, that those would still be in place. And if I'm anticipating that if they really wanted those kind of laws and rules to be changed, that they would have to come back here and we would have to make exceptions to those laws and rules. But the great thing about this bill is because it goes beyond monitoring or controlling maybe the harvesting and the access to these areas and what type of activity will take place there and the fishing that will take place there, of course, specifically, but it also gives us a lot of potential for more access to research and marketing for those areas. And one of the Department of Agriculture's concern was regarding the fish and coral stock, whose responsibility would it be after this in these managed areas? Whose responsibility would it be to monitor then the fish and coral stocks, which is currently the Department of Agriculture's responsibility. So they were thinking this was going to be now transferred to these community-based fisheries. So I think we need to address that also today. But it looks consistent with the current laws in place that talk about indigenous practices and trying to encourage indigenous fishing to be taught and practiced, even, you know, in a managed way in our preserves. So I like that part of the bill, that it's very consistent with that indigenous fishing cultural practices can be passed on in these areas. All right, so my concerns with this bill begin with the Department of Agriculture's #1 concern was, if we create a special managed area, an area to be managed by a community, does the Department of Agriculture have the responsibility to enforce the current fishing laws there? And we have seen too well the dispute in the Aganya Basin about who has the jurisdiction to enforce fishing laws in the boat basin. So we have the Department of Ag, and we have the Port Authority, who also has jurisdiction of all the marinas on Guam. So that is really the crux of what is going on there, and something that we also need to remedy. So I just want to prevent that problem in these areas by saying, first of all, that the first amendment that you have in front of you is that I'm going to add on page 2, line 37, where they talk about the plan that shall be created. Sorry, just let me. So section 4 talks about the purpose of this community-based fisheries management, and it says that it's to empower them and to ensure health, welfare, integrity, marine resources through a more holistic ecosystem-based management approach. So I'm going to add the words consistent with whatever the amendment says. Which shall be consistent with this chapter. And this chapter of Title V, Chapter 63, is all about fishing, hunting, and the take of animals, pretty much. Fish, game, forestry, and conservation. That's the title of this chapter. And so it would be consistent with that chapter and consistent with 9 GAR, Chapter 12, fishing regulations, which was pointed out earlier, that are in place for the marine preservation areas. So that is, for point #1, is just to make sure that what these community-managed systems will be able to do shall be consistent with existing law regarding fish take, pretty much, and other conservation practices that we've put in place. So I guess I'll pause on that, Mr. Speaker.
All right, on the Terlahi amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Senator Nelson. After Senator Nelson, anybody wish? Anybody else? Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to rise in support of this amendment. This is basically the amendment that will really address the concern that I made earlier, that we won't turn this into a commercial purpose fishery, but actually more of something of a preservation and a conservation that the Humada community can adopt and grow. So I'd like to thank the proffer of the amendment, and I support it.
Any other senator wish to be heard on the Terlahi amendment? On to the Terlahi amendment. If not, do you wish to close? Or if not, anything further, Madam Vice Speaker?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, and thank you to my colleagues for supporting that amendment. The other thing, I have another 2 amendments that are being passed out. Are they being passed out? If I may just speak on it. When we talk about, if you look, for example, so this bill does 2 things. It creates for the entire island a managed fisheries community-based fisheries management. So any community, any village pretty much is what we're looking at, any community can designate and manage an area. And then it very particularly gives authority to Humatak and kind of lets them be the pilot program for this island-wide program, and talks about who's going to help them, and that puts a timeline on them to create their rules and regs and their plan. So I too am very grateful that, or supportive that the author put into the Humatak part of this bill that they must comply with the AAA, the Administrative Adjudication Act, which in making their plan and any resulting rules and regs. So I would like to make that also applicable to the rest of the island, that for any community-based management plan, they shall also comply with the AAA, and not just Humatak. So my amendment would be up on line 39 on page 3 of the bill. So where it says the Director of Agriculture, the mayors, and municipal planning councils shall have the authority to designate community-based fisheries managed areas and develop fisheries management plans. I want to add the word subject to the AAA 5GCA Chapter 9. Thank
you. Any objection to the amendment?
Mr. Speaker, we're still waiting for the...
Okay, we'll take a recess.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, that one I didn't put in writing because the 5GCA Chapter 9 is the same as what's written in line 52. So I just want to add the words to the end of line 40, subject to the AAA 5GCA Chapter 9.
Can we proceed without being printed? Any objection to the amendment? Hearing none. You have further amendments?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And okay. All right, so the last two pretty much are I'm trying to address the Department of Agriculture's concerns about who will be enforcing these violations. And they did discuss during the public hearing that they have a current, a huge challenge trying to enforce the current fishing rules and regs for the marine preserves. And we've seen, I think, the scientists that came before us and others in the community, and actually the mayors have noticed that some of the preserves are successful, some are, they would say, surprisingly not as abundant in fish as they had hoped, and sometimes they suspect that this is illegal poaching in the marine preserves, and the Department of Ag admits that they are challenged in monitoring these areas. So I think they will be further challenged in monitoring these community-based areas, but we just have to make it the goal. And they have plans. So they talked about their plan about using community-based volunteers and also reservists, which are post-certified armed officers. So they're developing a plan for Conservation Reserve officers. And I think I saw in the news that the Guam Community College actually had a class, how do they call those? The group that went through that course already. So I think they're making good strides, and hopefully, we can help them to boost up their enforcement resources. There should be two. Okay. And, okay, so the floor amendment that was just passed out hopefully will address this, and it adds a new section to the bill that would say any fisheries management plan authorized by this act shall provide that the Department of Agriculture and the Guam Police Department shall have full authority to enforce fishing laws of Guam concurrent with any additional community enforcement measures or authority adopted in the fisheries management plan. And I'm hoping that this fisheries management plan, community-based, is going to actually help us to catch poachers, to catch people who are fishing in the ways that we as a community have decided not to allow. And so we want them to help, but I think we also have to allow the Department of Agriculture to maintain its authority in all areas of Guam, just so that we can have somebody who's actually been trained in law enforcement to come in when needed and and just to have a consistent island-wide enforcement of our laws and rules. And I added the Guam Police Department because I'm hoping that if the community comes up with their own way to enforce the laws, that they can just call the Guam Police Department for assistance when they think it's necessary. If it's something simple like no jet skiing today, I'm sure, you know, hopefully they can enforce that. But if they need Guam Police Department, I would hope that they can call and be afforded the resources. So that's my amendment, Mr. Speaker.
On this amendment by the Vice Speaker, anyone wish to speak? Senator Torres, do you wish to speak on it, or anyone, or any objection? All right, we'll have Senator St. Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm just with respect to the construction of the language here, it reads, any fisheries management plan authorized by this act shall provide the Department of Agriculture and the Guam Police Department shall have full authority to enforce fishing laws of Guam concurrent with any additional community enforcement measures or authority adopted in the fisheries management plan. Perhaps after police department, instead of saying shall have, it should say with.
Did you want to put the with?
After the Guam Police Department, strike shall have and put with. I think it would read better. So that with the amendment, it will say any fisheries management plan authorized by this act shall provide the Department of Agriculture and the Guam Police Department with full authority to enforce fishing laws of Guam concurrent with any additional community enforcement measures or authority adopted in the fisheries management plan.
It's been a proposed amendment by Senator St. Nicholas to amend the language, Madam Vice Speaker. Amendment to take out shall and replace it with.
Shall have, replace it with.
Senator Torres on the St. Nicholas amendment.
Mr. Speaker, I just would like some guidance from legal counsel, because this is what I was speaking to initially. The idea that can we really give authority for a government level enforcement agency to enforce the rules and regulations per this law of a municipal area? Because you're looking at different tiers now. And you know, the authority of one to enforce, I mean, they're governed by their laws, the laws of the land, the federal laws. The federal enforcement agencies enforce federal laws. They don't enforce local laws, they enforce federal laws. The Guam law enforcement enforces Guam laws. And now what we're doing is we're now mandating somebody to enforce at a level that is not within their area. And that's the concern I have. Is that a proper delegation of authority where someone is now beholden to the laws of another tier that is not within their designated level? In other words, we couldn't tell the federal government to enforce local laws. That's not their jurisdiction, nor is it our jurisdiction to meddle. It's just a delineation, and that's what and maybe I'm confused, and I just need to be reassured that no, you can in fact say to someone, because I know just within the areas where they have enforcement entities like the courts or the airport authority or the port authority, you cannot designate, you cannot mandate that they now enforce certain things. You couldn't say to the port authority, now you are in charge of this. I mean, they operate within their rules and regulations and their structure and their funding. much the same way the airport does, much the same way the judiciary, you know, maybe through mutual cooperation agreements, those sorts of supports exist. But that's what I'm grappling with, and that was the point about can you delegate, and can you in fact expect that a municipality can set up rules and regs, and it's beholden on the Guam Police Department to enforce that. They operate on a different tier. They enforce Guam laws. So if legal counsel may, I respectfully request just clear up that, because and it could be that I'm mistaken, and I just need to dispel with that concern.
Okay, I'll allow first the sponsor of the main amendment, not the technical grammatical change, but the main amendment, to respond to that. And then if her response is insufficient, then I'll take a recess so that legal counsel can provide you counsel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. Because, yes, there are two things going on. One is the Department of Agriculture says in their letter very clearly, number 3, enforcement of violation. The bill needs to state specifically if Department of Ag's conservation officers are enforcing any violations, or is it going to be the community? So I want to say very specifically that the Department of Agriculture shall enforce fishing laws of Guam, and that would be concurrent with whatever else they decide to do in the fisheries. So now, I'm not saying specifically that the Department of Ag has to enforce the new fishing rules in that managed area. That's going to have to be determined by the plan, how that would work. But I don't want the plan to preclude the Department of Agriculture from its jurisdiction in all areas of Guam. So I think I might be able to make it a little clearer if we added to enforce fishing laws of Guam, if I add the words within community-based fisheries. So this is just to ensure that their current jurisdiction is not being amended by this law at all. They still have jurisdiction in all areas, regardless of whether there is a community-based fisheries. They will enforce the laws of Guam. Now, all those additional rules that might come in under the community-based management plan, they're going to have to spell those out in their plan, and who's going to enforce those and things like that. So I'm hoping that if I can add the words, Mr. Speaker, within community-based fisheries after the laws of Guam, and the intent is, yeah, that when they come up with their plan, they just don't preclude any authority of Department of Ag or GPD, and it's a concurrent. So whatever other enforcement they want to come up, if they're going to have to spell that out for us through the AAA, or what other rules they want anyone to enforce. And
is that sufficient, or do you still wish us to have a recess for legal counsel?
That is clear. That is clear. So this is not mandating them to enforce any rules and regulations that may come up, and it doesn't take away their full authority. And that was my concern: is are we carving out are we carving something out of the bigger picture? And the retiring speaker essentially said no, it is not a carve out, and that jurisdiction over fishing regulations still exists. So that is acceptable, and I'm not as concerned with this particular amendment now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Then the amendment with the St. Nicholas grammatical correction. Any objection to changing the shall have to with?
Mr. Speaker, I understand the intent of this amendment to change the words shall have to with. I'm just concerned that it's sounding now like we are allowing the community-based management people to designate that the Guam Police Department, or the Department of Ag and Guam Police shall have jurisdiction. And I just wanted, they have jurisdiction as far as I'm concerned and how I'm reading this law right now, so I want to just make sure that the plan acknowledges that. Not that it gives them that authority, but it acknowledges that they shall have the authority. So I'm not sure the legal implications, so I hesitate to change that, Mr. Speaker.
So there's been a, Senator Nicholas, do you persist in your amendment?
Mr. Speaker, my only issue is when you read the amendment, it sounds like the shall provide the Department of Agriculture sounds like a hanging phrase. Shall provide them what? Shall provide the Department of Agriculture and the Guam Police Department shall have full authority to enforce. Is it shall provide the Department of Agriculture with full authority and the Guam Police Department shall have full authority?
It recognizes the full authority of the Police Department and the Department of Agriculture. We'll take a short recess. This legislature's back in session, in order. Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will withdraw that prior amendment, and I do have a follow-up amendment that would clarify.
Please. On the motion to withdraw, any objection?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the after the first shall on the initial sentence, strike the word provide and replace the word ensure. So it will read, any fisheries management plan authorized by this act shall ensure the Department of Agriculture and the Guam Police Department shall have full authority to enforce fishing laws of Guam, concurrent with any additional community enforcement measures or authority adopted in the fisheries management plan. Strike the word provide, replace the word ensure.
On this Nicholas amendment, no objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did have a question for the mover of the amendment, just to clarify. So would this amendment require the Department of Agriculture and the Guam Police Department to enforce any additional measures adopted in the plan, in the fisheries management plan? Would they be required to enforce those additional measures?
Mr. Speaker, were those additional words added earlier, that within community-based fisheries? The intent is no, that's not clear yet until they develop their plan, and if they want Department of Ag to enforce additional rules that they adopt pursuant to their plan, they would have to work that out in the plan. And I'm assuming that Department of Ag would have an opportunity at that point to state its objections or its concurrence or enter into an agreement to enforce additional rules and regs. Otherwise, no, this just continues their authority in the fisheries areas, the community-based fisheries. So I'm hoping that the plans will make that clear, and that no, we are not mandating that. We are saying that the plans are going to come up with their own enforcement measures, their own rules to enforce, but in no way does the Department of Agriculture's jurisdiction diminish in those areas for enforcing Guam laws.
It in no way diminishes in those areas?
Is that sufficient?
I appreciate the response, Mr. Speaker, but it just raises a concern because what we're doing in this act is we're allowing all of these different jurisdictions to create their own fisheries management plan. And it becomes problematic because if you're a police officer and you have 12 different management plans with 12 different rules and regulations, how would you know exactly which ones you're going to be enforcing in a particular jurisdiction? Police officers get moved to different precincts all the time, and I'm concerned that we may be creating a situation where there's going to be 10 different regulations on jet skis in 10 different beaches, and we're going to be inundating our police officers with enforcement situations. And then we're going to be having inconsistencies. Someone writes a ticket at one beach and the guy says, oh no, but based on this regulation it wasn't an offense, and then we're going into court and we're tying up everybody's time. And so I'm just concerned, are we going to have the police department and the conservation officers enforcing a uniform set of laws across all fisheries, and then these management plans are going to create an additional regulation that's going to have its own sub-body enforcing it? Or are we going to require a police officer to potentially learn 10, 12, or 15 different potential regulations with respect to a fisheries area? I think that that's important to understand, so that we're very clear about what we're doing here, Mr. Speaker. So if I can, I guess, pose that as a question or raise that as a concern with respect to the amendment.
Do you wish to yield?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, this is very in the same lines as the concerns that were brought up by a previous speaker, and I hear those concerns and I agree. But we will not know what additional rules and regs any community wants to put in place until they develop their plan. And that is going to be our opportunity to see who they think is going to enforce all those additional rules and regs in every place that comes up with an additional plan. So no, this amendment does not require them to enforce those additional rules. It says they are going to be able, regardless of those additional rules, to enforce the laws of Guam in those areas, and we are going to see what comes up in these plans, and hopefully with our oversight, we're going to be able to catch if there's any requirement in the plan that is going to require Department of Ag or anyone else in the government or other government agencies to spend additional resources in managing those fisheries areas. But no, the intent is that those are supposed to be managed by their own villages, and we're going to see what plan they come up with of how to enforce their additional rules. So that's not the intent of this.
Senator Nicholas, is that satisfactory?
I mean, it answers the question, but I guess it just reinforces the concern. Basically, the response is that it likely would happen if they did adopt different rules and regulations. We just don't know until it's adopted. But we're basically opening the door for that to happen. And I'm concerned that we're going to create a system that almost becomes unenforceable because it's just so varied. The intent is to have a community fisheries program that is going to protect and preserve while at the same time enable. And if we're talking about the likelihood of so many different areas having so many different rules and regs, I mean, I can just imagine a police officer just not even wanting to bother. And not because they don't want to do their job, but only because it's inundating. And so I think that we need to perhaps empower a community enforcement level with respect to rules and regulations, but make sure that our police officers are able to understand that there's a uniform standard that they can at least make sure that they're enforcing on a consistent basis. And that is my concern, Mr. Speaker, because we're trying to make it work, but it's also going to have to work on the back end as well as the front end. And while we want to empower the communities, we also want to make sure that those who are responsible for enforcing that empowerment that we've extended to our communities are actually going to be able to do so to a reasonable extent. And so, Madam Speaker, that's just my concern that I'm raising, and I'll yield if there's any other wisdom to be shared with respect to the issue.
Thank you, Senator San Nicolas. I'll recognize the Vice Speaker and then Speaker Cruz.
Thank you very much. There is nothing in this bill that extends the authority of the Department of Agriculture to enforce any additional rules. Nothing right now. So I'm not worried about that right now. And I don't even think that through the AAA process, any community could extend or force the Department of Agriculture to do anything. They can't do that by rules and regs down in Pneumatic. That's not how this is supposed to work, I don't think. I think that's going to have to happen through law. So I am not worried about that at all, that anyone's going to force any mandates especially unfunded mandates on the Department of Agriculture or any other government agency. They are going to have to come up with a plan in their area if they want to enforce these additional rules or management practices that they come up with. And thank you.
Thank you, Vice Speaker. Speaker Cruz, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I think it's very clear that there are paramount laws. The federal laws are superior and paramount to the state and local ones. We're going to be addressing that in 210 this afternoon with medicinal marijuana and some others. In this one, there's a paramount law that the police will be enforcing throughout the island on trespass. But we also know that there are within the community the authority for homeowners associations to have rules within their homeowners association, within the gated community at Talo Verde, within the gated community at wherever, within the condos of certain things. And when and if a person violates those and it's the decision of the homeowners association to evict or to do something with that, they call on the authorities for assistance. Police don't know in every condo going in Tumon or into Mooning what the rules are in each one of those condos. But if the homeowners association calls and says, our homeowners association doesn't provide for bed and breakfast, and there's tenants are here on a bed and breakfast that is not allowed, and they want some assistance, they will call the police. We've not asked the police to memorize every law and every homeowners association rule, but when and if they're called on for assistance, they will come and assist. This is all that we're doing, giving the 19 villages the opportunity to say, in my village, it's a free-for-all. In my village, though the Guam Legislature and the Bureau of Statistics and Planning and Agriculture only want 5 MPAs, I want to be the 6th, and I want to be the 7th, and I want to be the 8th. Go at it. And if you have a problem and you need assistance, you call the police. And they will make the determination of whether or not they're going to do any enforcement and whether or not it's within their jurisdiction. And with this, we're saying it should provide the police and the Department of Agriculture with the recognition or ensure that they have continuing jurisdiction over those areas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would any other member wish to be heard on the Siniclis amendment? If not, Senator Siniclis, you're invited to close.
Madam Speaker, I don't think I proffered an amendment. I posed a question with respect to the enforcement. And so I appreciate the retiring speaker's commentary. So if the issue is that we're going to have agriculture and the GPD enforce the laws of Guam, and that we want them to assist with the enforcement of any subsequent rules and regulations that were adopted, I think that it's necessary for us to clarify that their role will be one of assisting as opposed to them being expected to know when to cite somebody or ticket somebody based on a varied rule or regulation in any jurisdiction. I don't want a police officer to get called down to a beach by some person who's on the beach, and the police officer has to make a judgment call on enforcing a regulation that they're not familiar with. On the example of the homeowners association, the police officer, I believe, is being called to assist, but then they're enforcing a law with respect to whether or not it's trespassing or whether or not there's an eviction notice that needs to be served. they're assisting somebody who's ultimately going to have to answer to the call. To just say that they're going to have blanket authority and they have to go out and enforce it, I mean, I'm worried that we are basically telling them to go and learn every single homeowners association rules and reg, but with respect to every single marine preserve or fisheries management plan that's adopted. And I just want to make sure that we're very clear about that. And so I would like to proffer an amendment after the word Guam, full authority to enforce fishing laws of Guam. I'd like to add the word and change the word concurrent to concurrently, and add the word assist. So full authority to enforce fishing laws of Guam and concurrently assist with any additional community enforcement measures or authority adopted in the fisheries management plan. That way it's very clear that their role is to assist when they're being called by these particular groups who have their own particular plans, but they're not going to be expected to know 10 or 15 different fisheries management plan regulations with respect to how big of a tent you can set up on the sand, for example. So I'd like to make that amendment, Madam Speaker, add the word and concurrently assist with any community enforcement measures.
I'd like to call a brief recess.
back in order.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the mover of the amendment.
Madam Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to withdraw that amendment and proffer a cleaner one that's simpler and does not, pretty much takes out the last half of this sentence so that we're just acknowledging. The new amendment would read, well, if I'm allowed to, Mr. Speaker, withdraw the original amendment.
On the motion to withdraw the amendment, any objection?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the new amendment, if you could use your existing sheets, it's going to be the same first sentence. Any fisheries management plan authorized by this act shall, and I would like to add the word acknowledge, that the Department of Agriculture and the Guam Police Department shall have full authority to enforce laws of Guam within community-based fisheries. Not fishing laws, but just the laws of Guam, period, within community-based fisheries, period. So we are not addressing anything about the management enforcement until those plans come out, Mr. Speaker. Repeat it, Mr. Speaker. Any fisheries management plan authorized by this act shall acknowledge that the Department of Agriculture and the Guam Police Department shall have full authority to enforce laws of Guam within community-based fisheries, period.
Does everybody understand that amendment? Or do you wish to have it in writing? Okay. On that amendment, is there any senator who wishes to be heard on this new Terlahi amendment? Any objection? You have another amendment, Madam Vice Speaker?
Just one more, and I thank my colleagues for your patience and helping me get through this. Okay, so there's just one more concern that the Department of Agriculture that I thought was not fully taken care of in the bill, and I would like to do that if we can, and that is their second concern said monitoring of the resources in Yamatak, such as fish and coral stocks, is supposed to be the responsibility of the community. If so, then there would be minimal impact to the department. Well, currently it's the responsibility of the Department of Agriculture. They are the ones we are looking to be the experts in how to manage our fisheries and what areas are good, why the areas are not good, I mean, all of that. So, and then during the hearing, the public hearing, they talked about the data that they wanted to make sure that all the data collected, that government agencies would have full access to that data. And I can see that for, we have, another council related to fishing and of course the Department of Ag. And so my amendment would be, this final amendment is to add that the fisheries management plans authorized by this act shall specify who shall be granted access to monitor fish and coral stock, or to change that word shall in your papers to, or to assess the success of management goals in other ways, and shall provide that all data will be shared with the relevant Municipal Planning Council, the Department of Agriculture, the Bureau of Statistics and Plans, and the University of Guam Marine Lab. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On this Terlahi amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Any senator wish to be heard? There being none, is there an objection? There being none.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much to my colleagues, and especially thanks to the authors of the bill. And I hope this is it's a new thing for us. It's something that we've heard the mayors, they really do want to have control. I'm hoping that all of them will be able to feel, part of this, or to use this law for the benefit of their communities, and to provide what we've always been trying to provide, and that is a way of life, a sustainable way of life, and to teach these practices to our children. So, Situus Masi to all of you involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? Senator St. Nicholas on the main motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In reviewing the language of the measure, we're going to be authorizing the establishment of rules and regulations that are going to pretty much govern these fishing areas. The parameters are not narrow at all. They're actually pretty wide open. Practically any rule and regulation can be established. My concern is that the mandate to allow for the public to be able to potentially revisit these rules and regulations and amend them if they're dissatisfied, it isn't concrete. For example, on page 3, line 53, such rules and regulations may be revisited annually for revision through the AAA process. So if a community adopts rules and regulations establishing these community-based fisheries, because there's no mandate for that rule and regulation to come under a review, it's possible that a rule or regulation could be established and it will never have the opportunity to be changed. You probably have to come before this body to be able to get it changed, or you'll have to elect a new mayor, and a new municipal planning council will have to come in to be able to go in and change it if the community is not satisfied with it. And so what I would like to do is make sure that every year on an annualized basis, these community-based fisheries, these management plans have to be brought before their communities again. They don't necessarily need to be changed, but I think that the community should be afforded the opportunity to, on an annualized basis at the very least, be able to weigh in as to whether or not the rules and regulations that were adopted by this act were something that they want to allow to continue in force. We can have examples of a rule or regulation being adopted, sounding good at the time, and the community, or at least certain members of the community, are unhappy with it. And at what point are they going to be able to bring that grievance out and to potentially impact the existing or the adopted rule and regulation? It's not a part of a mandated process. And so I would like to maybe the indulgence of the body to consider that we require the municipal planning council and the mayor and whoever was involved in the adoption of these to, on an annualized basis, through the AAA process, open up these rules and regulations once again for the community to be able to come forward and express any concerns they may have of what was adopted. Otherwise, technically, it could be adopted, and the only way it can be changed, it'll have to come before this body. And so if the intent is to empower the communities, let's make sure that that it's not going to be a situation where they have one group come in and establish rules and regulations and kind of lock things up. And so I'd like to potentially change the words may be revisited annually to shall on page 3, line 53 as an initial amendment, Mr. Speaker.
This Nicholas amendment is to change may to shall. Senator Estevez.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in objection to this amendment. I think it really takes away from the aspect of empowering not only the village mayors, but the NPCs and the community in general. With applying this mandate, we're basically almost forcing the community to have to go through the arduous process of the AAA process every year, which in some cases can take an entire year for final approval. So I just see this as turning into one constant workload that the MPC has, taking away from the functionality of the village itself. So keeping the current language of may allows the process to work. I don't think it should be of this body to decide in statute and mandate what happens in that MPC. If a constituent of the village has a concern, they have avenues to approach it and address their grievances to the MPCs and to the mayor. Then which they will go through a process through village meetings with the MPC and make the changes necessary. But to mandate this law is just putting an undue burden on the community to be compliant with the law. So instead of doing other things necessary for the village, they're just focused on trying to be compliant with the law year after year through a very difficult process of AAA. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. There's been an objection. Anybody else on the main motion? I mean, not the main motion, on the St. Nicholas amendment to shall. There's been an objection to the amendment proffered by Senator St. Nicholas. Do you wish to close, Senator St. Nicholas?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Let's just be mindful that if we do not require this to be an annual review type of situation, then whatever is adopted has a potential to remain in force indefinitely. We have some mayors who've been mayors of their villages for a very, very long time, and getting reelected to the office of mayor has a lot of elements to it, not just how you're handling your fishing area. And if we were to create a situation where a rule or regulation was adopted and we don't have a system by which the communities that are affected are able to bring forward concerns in an official capacity so that everybody in the community can be involved, almost like a public hearing type of setting, then we could potentially lock up an entire community into a situation that may not be advantageous to the affected parties. And so what I'm hoping we can do is, this isn't going to require that rules and regs be readopted every single time, but what it would do is it would require that they be reviewed every single year. They open it up back up, a public notice is put out. Anybody who wants to discuss our fisheries management plan that's been duly adopted, please show up at this date, and we're going to be entertaining any concerns that the community has. The community can come forward and say, hey, you know, we adopted a rule and regulation that says that, you know, we don't want anybody setting up, you know, 20 by 30 canopies or any kind of canopies on the beach because it's affecting the crabs or what have you. I'm not sure. But it's possible that you adopt a regulation that all of a sudden the community didn't even see coming. And so how are they going to be able to, at their very own community-based level, bring forward any grievances they have with respect to what was adopted and try and get redress to those grievances? Because we don't require some kind of annual review of what's being adopted, you could technically have something put in place that's going to lock everybody up, and they're going to have to come before the legislature, or someone's going to have to make a phone call, and then it becomes one of those situations where, you know, it's not a community member being able to bring forward a concern and air a grievance and have their community-based fisheries management team address it. It's going to be, you know, who am I able to get in touch with that's going to be able to push forward my issue? And I don't think that's what we're trying to set up here. So we can leave it at May, but I'm just concerned that we're going to adopt things that are going to be in place, and there's not going to be any kind of avenue for any kind of concerns to be able to be brought forward and addressed by the very parties that are establishing that regime. So that's my amendment, Mr. Speaker. It's subject to the will of the body. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker?
Senator Espaldon.
Notwithstanding.
I think we closed.
Point of order. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think he closed.
I've closed. There's been an objection to the amendment. All those in favor of the objection, please indicate by raising your hand. There's been an objection. There's been an objection to the San Nicolas Amendment. All those in favor of the San Nicolas Amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. Senator San Nicolas, anything further? If not, Senator Espaldon on the main motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on the previous motion, I really listened intently to the arguments of both sides. I appreciated the mover of the amendments position, but I also appreciated what the objection was. So I would now like to make that motion, perhaps revisit it, and I make the motion that line 52, 53 on page 3 be amended to read, such rules and regulations may be revisited, shall be revisited annually for any revision that needs to be made through the AAA process. That way, it's clear that if there is a revision, they shall review it, and if there is a revision necessary, then it shall proceed forward. But it then encompasses both arguments of the previous motion, that a revision is not necessarily does not necessarily have to be made, but it also supports the idea that at least the rules and regulations will be revisited for the entire community to be able to discuss. So my motion now is to have that sentence on line 52 on page 3 to read, such rules and regulations shall be revisited annually for any revisions that need to be made through the AAA process. That way it encompasses both the positive arguments that both of the parties, our colleagues, made in the prior discussion.
On the Espaldon Amendment, anyone wish to speak on the Espaldon Amendment? Is there an objection to the Espaldon Amendment? Any objection to the Espaldon?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Anyone further on the main motion?
Just a point of order, Mr. Speaker. The amendment that just passed was with respect to page 3, lines 52 and 53, which only affected section 63117.2 of the Humatec Fisheries Managed Area and Plan. But if we go up to page 3, lines 38 to 40, it also speaks to the authority to designate community-based fisheries and fisheries management plans for mayors and municipal planning councils. And so we don't have the same requirement to have an annual revisitation for revision in that particular section. So I wanted to raise that as a point of order. I already spoke on the measure, but perhaps an amendment for consistency needs to also be placed in that section, Mr. Speaker.
There was an amendment that was offered at the end of that sentence earlier by, at this point I can't remember who, by the Vice Speaker. So that would have to be Is there any, without objection, I'm going to allow either Senator Espaldon or Senator San Nicolas, either one of you, I know you've already spoken on the main motion, but if you want to make this amendment at this point, please do so now. Senator San Nicolas, if you wish to make the amendment, I'll recognize you to make the amendment, but also take into account that whatever amendments have already been made on that section by the Vice Speaker will remain, but you're just adding on something else.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in light of that, and in light of all the work that's been done thus far, I would just like to make it be an amendment to yield to legal counsel to include language in lines 38 to 40 that will be consistent with the language that's in place in lines 52 to 53.
Any objection to that? Thank you. On the main motion with all of the amendments, Anyone wish to speak? If not, Senator Castro, you're welcome to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleagues for the valid points that were raised for the past couple of hours here on the discussion on Bill 86. It was an enlightening process for me. I participated in local, regional, subnational discussions, Mr. Speaker, but I've never been a part of a more lively and fruitful, not debate, but discourse on community-based fisheries management practices. So I thank all of you for contributing to the bill in its current form. Like many who have spoken before me, I too have faith in our people and the collective consciousness of this community and our Pacific way of life. Bill 86 attempts to establish a community-based fisheries planning model that will find its beginning and sustainability at the village level. If done right, it's our hope that we will see how managing our marine resources will affect food supply, employment, cultural, and traditional fishing practices. At its core, as I stated earlier, Bill 86-34 empowers coastal villages to have a greater say in managing its waters and all related activities that may affect the marine resources associated with that coastal village. And so I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to offer remarks. I want to thank the co-sponsors of the bill and all the movers of amendments. Thank you again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for endorsing the bill.
On the motion to send the bill to the voting file, there being no objection, we'll take a recess until 2 o'clock.